A fairly simple way of thinking about the basal ganglia system is by remembering certain key concepts, and then no need for mnemonics, and it won't feel difficult anymore. Key concept number one, to initiate a movement, we need to activate the thalamus, and to end a movement, we need to stop the thalamus. Why? Because the thalamus excites the motor cortex, and excitation of the motor cortex leads to initiation of movement. Concept number two, we can have only one thalamus at a time, whether it's the subthalamic nucleus or whether it's the thalamus itself. We can only have one at a time. All right? The third thing is that you need to put in your mind is that these are two separate pathways. They cannot coexist, which is what personally confused me in textbooks and videos when they draw all the elements together. If you drew them separately, you'll understand, and if you understand that each one happens one at a time, there are no two happening at the same time, it'll make much more sense. Now, it all begins from the substantia nigra over here, all right? So the substantia nigra releases dopamine, and via the dopaminergic pathway, which is the nigrostriatal pathway, the dopamine is going to go from the substantia nigra to the striatum, all right? Now, as the dopamine goes, again, via the nigrostriatal pathway from the substantia nigra to the striatum, it's up to the receptor that is found on the striatum whether we are going to continue in the direct pathway or in the indirect pathway. However, regardless, we're going to touch on this at the end. Now, what makes the difference between the direct and the indirect pathway is that the striatum, which is the major inhibitor in here, is the boss man. It's up to the striatum whether it wants to inhibit the globus pallidus internus or whether it wants to inhibit the globus pallidus externus. No, this is wrong over here. I'm sorry. That's a mistake. All right. So it's up to the striatum whether it wants to inhibit the globus pallidus internus or the globus pallidus externus. Now, if the striatum decides to inhibit the globus pallidus internus, then it's freeing the thalamus from the inhibition of the globus pallidus internus. And by freeing the thalamus, we are initiating a movement, because remember the key concept, thalamus means movement. On the other hand, if the striatum decides that it wants to inhibit the globus pallidus externus, it means that it has freed the subthalamus. However, remember that only one thal can exist at a time. So once we have the subthalamus activated, it's going to go like, I have to inhibit the thalamus because it's either me or the thalamus here. So the subthalamus is going to go and activate the globus pallidus internus, which accordingly is going to inhibit the thalamus. And accordingly, we are going to end whatever movement we are at. So just remember, globus pallidus externus inhibits the subthalamus, and the globus pallidus internus inhibits the thalamus. And it's up to the striatum whether it wants to inhibit this or inhibit that. And if we have one thal at a time, then we can expect that once we have activated the subthalamus, it's going to try to get the thalamus out of the game by activating its inhibitor, which is the globus pallidus internus. Now, this is obviously the indirect pathway, which works on inhibiting or ending movement. This is the direct pathway, which promotes or initiates movement. And what really determines whether the striatum decides to inhibit the globus pallidus internus or whether it wants to inhibit the globus pallidus externus? It's the dopamine receptor. So if dopamine binds to D1, it's going to start the direct pathway and it's going to initiate movement. However, if it's going to bind to the D2 receptor, it's going to activate the indirect pathway, which is going to end or inhibit the movement that we are actively doing. So that is all, and yeah, good luck.